Hello, goodbye, and good day, sunshine. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, for The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio. Hopefully, it hasn't been too much of a hard day's night this September 16th, 2014, because you're about to take a magical mystery tour. This edition of The Mind's Eye will be like a taste of honey on the tip of your tongue. And by now, you can probably tell by my overusage of puns that we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Our guest in tonight's merriment is Kenneth Womack, author and editor of several books devoted to the Beatles, including The Beatles Encyclopedia, Everything Fab Four, Reading the Beatles, Cultural Studies, Literary Criticism, and the Fab Four, and the Independent's 2009 Music Book of the Year, The Cambridge Companion to the Beatles. Womack also happens to be the author of 3 award-winning novels, John Doe No. 2 and The Dreamland Motel, The Restaurant at the End of the World, and Playing the Angel. In addition, Ken's work as professor of English and Integrative Arts at Penn State University's Altoona College has earned him numerous awards. But our focus for this evening is on his phenomenal book, Long and Winding Roads, The Evolving Artistry of the Beatles. By mapping the group's development as an artistic fusion, Womack traces the Beatles' creative arc from their first primitive recordings through Abbey Road and the twilight of their career. Kenneth, the Professor Womack, will reveal the ways in which the Beatles gave life to a musical synthesis that would change the world. And he'll also give us some hints on some of the few mysteries that still linger about the band. Stay tuned for The Mind's Eye after this quick commercial break. And with no further delay, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Kenneth, the Professor Womack, award-winning novelist, highly acclaimed educator, musicologist, and Beatles expert / lecturer. Thank you so much for giving us a piece of your time tonight, Ken.
It is a great pleasure to be with you too.
And if you can't tell, I am quite excited for this one and to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Beatles' legendary appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. And I know, Ken, you were a small child when the band broke up, and personally, I wasn't even born yet, so apologies for dating us here for the moment. But how did you get how did you get turned on to them? And tell us your personal fan story with the Beatles.
Well, my story is slightly embarrassing, so that makes it a lot more fun. I discovered the Beatles around 1978, maybe 77, 78 or so, watching the Beatles cartoons of all things. And of course, real fans typically look down on the cartoons as being kind of sophomoric, which they are. And they had come on because they had replaced my favorite morning TV show, which was the New Zoo Review, by the way. And the New Zoo Review had been, I guess, canceled. And here were these Beatles cartoons, and I was instantly hooked. And I wasn't hooked by the fake personalities of the cartoons so much as I was by the music. I was instantly struck by it. It was very different than what I was hearing in the mid to late 1970s, and I was very excited by it. And I had doting parents who very quickly went to the library and came home with a stack of books, those incipient early Beatles books that were out for scholars around that time. There wasn't that much, believe it or not, and I was off to the races. And I had a fun moment, in fact, at Beatles Fest just a few weeks ago in Chicago, and a fellow named Ron Campbell from Australia was there giving a talk, and Ron was the animator for those cartoons, so I made sure we got our photo taken together.
Phenomenal, excellent, and those cartoons were sometimes could be quite out there, but to say the least, they were always entertaining. And for me
They
personally,
certainly were.
yeah, and for me personally, I guess I've always been a huge fan. My sister, she was given the name Michelle. My mom was always a fan. So I guess you can say for me personally, I was born into the Beatles. Even though my mom, she likes the first half of their stuff, and more the early stuff, while I kind of like the more, I guess, zanier, crazier stuff in the later ones where they really developed. But to each their own, I guess, when it comes to the Beatles. And what about you? Would you say you prefer the beginning, the early formative years, or more the later years where it was Revolver, White Album, Abbey Road? What was your favorite particular phase?
If I had to have a preference, I think I would tend toward the later years. But I read or interpret the Beatles as a kind of evolving art object. So when I think about them, they're always, as they literally were working toward those later recordings. So it's the natural result of where they were going, whatever direction they were going in as artists. And so, yeah, I do think I do tend to enjoy those recordings more, but they're all valuable because they're all pieces of one singular story with so many different chapters. And that's actually what fascinates me about this year, where we're celebrating the Beatles and all of these 50th anniversaries. One thing I like to remind fans and commentators around the world is when the Beatles are trolling around the world in 1964 and they're on their concert tours and they're making the Hard Day's Night movie, et cetera, the future is a glint in their eye at best. These fabulous things are out there that they're going to do, these incredible pioneering recordings, and we don't even have the first inkling of them yet 50 years ago.
It's so true, and so true, and that's a perfect segue into what we really want to talk about tonight. And let's focus on your excellent book, Long and Winding Roads, The Evolving Artistry of the Beatles. And for me, particularly, two reasons that I loved it was that, first, as the reader, I felt like a bug on the wall watching the band artistically coalesce, and secondly, I guess it mainly focused on the artistry instead of the normal hearsay, while you still hit on the individual's points of personal and musical influence. And afterwards, I really had a true appreciation for the creative forces that were the Beatles, and not just individuals.
Well, I'm very touched. You really seem to get the book in the ways that I meant for it to be read, as a kind of unfolding narrative about that artistry, which is, of course, why we still love them. And that's why kids today, when they discover the Beatles and they go to iTunes or YouTube rather, and they discover them, they're there, fully formed, ready to be studied and enjoyed, and they just take them as a matter of course that this magical, wonderful thing exists.
So let's talk about that creative force. And in my opinion, I don't really ever think it can be replicated, because explain to me how these four people can produce that amount of high quality work in, really, I guess it was a single decade.
But it was certainly much less than a single decade in many ways. They make their first recordings, at least the ones that will become official Beatles recordings in September 1962, and fewer than 7 years later, they're done. They finish up in August 1969. So it's an incredible trajectory, really, when you consider it. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the forces of the contemporary world are very much against this kind of phenomenology occurring again, for a couple of reasons. One, their initial explosion in the world's consciousness happened in a way that would be very difficult to replicate or even come close to now. We don't have nearly 3 networks on TV. When you look out in the world, we have 24-hour sports, 24-hour cable, and I think I have like 1,000 channels listed under my cable system now. We have the internet, we have all of these other bands trying to make it. We have so many other things we can be interested in on a daily basis. The world was, in some ways, certainly in terms of popular culture, less complex than it is now. And so the Beatles evolved in this world that really was waiting for them, and they didn't have the kind of competition for our mind space that one would have now. So you certainly have that issue. And the other factor that you can never discount with them, and this is why I love teaching them, teaching their story, their artistry to students. The Beatles worked like dogs. They worked long days for those nearly 7 years. They worked very long hours, particularly when they entered what we might call the studio years. They worked very long hours trying to make their art, and they came from a very homogeneous working class culture, up in the North Country, up in Liverpool, where when you got to a certain age, you worked for a living, and they lived that. And so when you have these factors coming together, not to mention this innate talent and ambition, you really got something, and it's something that's proven to be quite unique.
Yeah, their work ethic was amazing. They turned out an unbelievable amount of songs, like we said, in really that 7-year clip, but they were also writing for music for other artists, and they were doing the movies on top of that, so they were doing a little bit of everything at the time, and no one can deny their work ethic. I think that's probably one of the most underrated aspects of the Beatles, is how hard they really did work, and you just gave an excellent explanation for that. And, so let's kind of start with their formative years as fledgling songwriters, the era leading up to and finally the completion of their first album, Please Please Me. Here they are, they're boys in Liverpool, England, and the band goes through a numerous amount of incarnations, different band names, multiple members shifting in and out until finally John, Paul, George, and Ringo are locked in. And to me, reading your book, it seemed that it certainly was rocky, a lot of personal, professional obstacles in the way, and it almost easily could not have existed as much as it did. Would you agree with that? There were so many obstacles for all of them.
You bet, and that's a very good way to put it. And going back to the world of students, people like to believe that they were these geniuses who sprung fully formed, from Mount Olympus or someplace. And of course, it's not like that at all. They led real lives. They had families. They had the challenges of, in some cases, certainly not John's, but being working poor to a certain degree, as we might call it today. And as you said, any number of those obstacles could have pushed them off of the path. The fact that John and Paul were even able to stay together for those many years until they finally get to George Martin in the studio in 1962 is really kind of amazing. That they survived Hamburg, that their band didn't break up in the way that so many of those other skiffle groups. There were 10,000 of them at one time in the mid-1950s, and of course almost all of them break up eventually. And actually fairly precipitously. And the fact that these guys managed to stumble along and stay together is kind of a minor miracle. They had girlfriends along the way, all sorts of issues with family members. John and Paul's mothers both perish at a young age. So all of these challenges are occurring that could have sorted them out on many different paths, not leading to Abbey Road Studios.
And the Beatles, they were visually polished by the time they came to America, but before landing here on the shores of the U.S., during their formative years that we were talking about, they were used to playing these grimy nightclubs, and they didn't really act or look like these preordained characters that we were used to. And to me, and this may be a little off, but to me, they had this punk sense to them. They had this attitude, and it was us against the world, and to me, that was punk before it was punk.
I've never heard it quite stated that way, but I think that's very apropos, and probably necessary for their survival in post-war Germany. This is post-war, let's get it right, West Germany, right?
Right, wow, that's excellent point.
All of those years are taking place in Hamburg, and that kind of in-your-face attitude, which was a kind of proto or pre-punk, certainly was a survival mechanism. And that band, as we know from history, goes from being, a fairly run-of-the-mill former skiffle group in 1960 to a pretty solid rock combo after that first residency was over. They really learned how to play in the ways that Well, I like to think most people would after putting in so many hours on stage. You know, it's the famous chapter in Malcolm Gladwell's book about the 10,000-hour rule. The Beatles certainly did conquer that, if nothing else.
No doubt. It definitely has a testament to the work ethic that we were talking about. And one specific story that I really enjoyed from the book was the first time that John and Paul met as boys, and both of them, they instantly recognized each other's talents, but Lennon, you wrote about, was immediately cognizant of how McCartney could actually interfere with his own superiority, and yet still, for the creative good, Lennon knew it was really best to have him in the group, and it was a testament to his musicianship, which I believe so.
Oh, well said, and it's a moment of really great ambition from John. He liked, before he met Paul, hanging out with these knucklehead friends of his. These were just the kids he knew from Quarry Bank High School. Nothing really more than that. They didn't have any kind of musical aspirations other than to do what they were doing. They barely knew chords, and he saw something, as you said, very quickly. There was an epiphanic moment when he saw Paul. What was the famous quote? He looked like Elvis, and he recognized that this kid really had a spark. And it's an amazing moment of blind ambition. But what I love about it is the next few weeks when they invite Paul to be in the band, and then he misses their first concert, the Quarrymen's their next concert, because he and his brother Michael are away at Boy Scout camp. I love that detail. It's charming on the one hand, but it reminds us of, how fickle the life of a teenager is, right? We all remember those days. Very few things held our attention. And Paul had to go off to camp, and that's what you said your parents said you were doing, and so he did. But it reminds us once again, about that era and being young, quite frankly, that they come from many of the same places that we all do.
Yeah, and as a teenager, I would probably be guilty of the same thing. But it's just so funny that it almost plays into his character as the boy, the nice one. That here he was often skipping the Beatles, but going to Boy Scout. It almost plays, as much as he wasn't that character, he almost was in a sense.
I'm glad you said that. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm glad you said that, because Paul is known as the nice one. But John was the nice one. John liked the guys in the group, and when you start to study those early years, while John had a certain attitude about him, he was happy just to have his pals in the band, and would have kept on doing so. It was Paul and then later George who really quite systematically removed every single original member of the Quarrymen except John from the band. I mean, it's really stunning. Paul's ambition was not blind at all. It was very much up front and center, whereas John was recognizing those political sensibilities long before McCartney ever would.
Yeah, and I think that's also an understated part, that into their breakup, obviously it was a confluence of factors, but Paul's image to this day almost overlooms the fact that he probably did have a big part into them breaking up. People almost couldn't even stand being in the same room with him by the end of it. So it's amazing how much an image can loom over everything, maybe even the truth, really, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely.
And so let's skip ahead a few years, past the Quarrymen, and now we're in the early years, and they're starting to write some good stuff. And John and Paul, we know them. They write over 75% of the songs in the beginning parts of With the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Rubber Soul, yada yada. The two wrote nearly all of the hits during this time, and during these years, the Beatles were discovering, they were fine-tuning their songwriting process. So when you're thinking of the Beatles, it's hard not to think of, up until at least Revolver, you're thinking the relationship between these two. So can you talk about the Lennon-McCartney songwriting relationship and how it evolved throughout the years?
Well, at first, of course, it's just them sitting in Paul's front parlor, writing these songs in a special spiral notebook they had. where they would write their Lennon and McCartney originals, which, by the way, is an amazing thing for kids from Liverpool in that period to think. To have that kind of ambition is amazing, because the world really expected nothing from them other than to go work in the shipyards or be on the dole or do some kind of backbreaking work. Nothing wrong with it, but that's what the world expected from them. Probably die at a younger age from all of that hard, grueling work. And yet they imagined themselves becoming these kinds of artists. It's really stunning when you think about it in those ways. But their songwriting evolved very quickly, and probably was more of a partnership in those early years than it would be later on. And there were some interesting factors that caused that to come about. I would argue that some of their greatest magic happened when they were in the same room. The story behind "I Want to Hold Your Hand," sitting at that piano in Jane Asher's basement, I think it was, or later writing "With a Little Help from My Friends" together. These kind of things where they just struck gold and they knew it and they could see into each other's eyes and recognize what they were doing. But interestingly, and again, this goes back to our 50-year sort of backwards glance examination of how the Beatles came about. When you look at 1964, they really haven't done anything yet. I mean, none of those great classics have been written. There's no Yesterday. There's no Norwegian Wood. There's no Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Nothing is even, on the front burner yet. And yet, Lennon and McCartney are the subject of 3 different network television shows, 2 in the UK and 1 in the United States, about the genius of Lennon and McCartney. Now, imagine what that does to you when you're, your early 20s. You don't think you're anything yet, and you're being lauded in front of, every demographic that you're a genius. And it's an amazing how when you look from that moment and trace their songwriting after that, the stakes of authorship go way up at that point. And the competition between those 2 guys and in and amongst the band just skyrockets. And on the one hand, it probably does some negative things to their relationship, but on the other hand, it creates all of this great music because they're more than capable of meeting that challenge.
And they definitely were such a co-writing team. It's so sad to think that if by the end, during the disintegration years, that it was so individualized in writing. I can't imagine by that point they were just such amazing musicians. If they just came together, the music that they could have written. But there's nothing you can really do to answer that. Just think about it. And really, they had 2 completely different writing styles. Give us a taste of how different these 2 were when it came to composing songs.
Well, of course, they were more homogeneous at the beginning, and there was some similarity there. But they began to probably diverge just around music and lyricism, quite frankly. I mean, John certainly was probably a more verbal person, as it turns out. He obviously was affected by their relationship to Bob Dylan. In 1964, the Beatles were listening to Dylan almost exclusively as they traveled around. They were listening to his albums. And, I think that had an enormous effect on him. So you can start to see the language qualities of his music really growing and becoming enhanced. Meanwhile, Paul had this really otherworldly natural gift for melody. Even so much that when you look at those final interviews with John Lennon before his untimely death, he's still questioning his own ability at melody. And the foil for that, even though it's not always spoken, is Paul. So, the richness that you get in that group between these 2 different styles is really incredible. To have this kind of lyrical richness, thoughtfulness, and then also this kind of innate musical quality. They're just doing things that others weren't doing. But they did seem to evolve around these 2 qualities. And if you follow the Beatles after the disbandment, roughly in August, September 1969, and you listen to their solo recordings, it's interesting to see how they kind of hang on for a little bit to the evolving artistry they had, you know, in songs like Maybe I'm Amazed and Imagine and George's All Things Must Pass album. You can really sort of still trace the trajectory of where the Beatles might have gone. But I find that as we move further and further away from 1969, and I listen to songs by John or songs by Paul, all I can think is they really need each other, you know? What they're missing is the other's melody or the other's lyrics or the other's even good or bad-natured criticism.
Yeah, they really were the yin to each other's yang, and to me, from reading up, it seemed that Paul was the more disciplined of the two when it came to writing music. He would always almost keep track of him, so he always made sure he had some time to write it almost every day, and it became more of a ritual for him. While on the other hand, Lennon seemed to be the one where he needed that musical inspiration, and whenever he got it, that's when he became this obsessive writer. But otherwise, you know, there might be periods of huge gaps between when he would write, and it really seemed that they were so different in so many ways, but they really needed each other. They played so well off of each other.
Right, and I would agree with that. I think Paul certainly went around about it in a more business-like fashion. John could ride that inspiration, you know, for quite a bit of time, as even we saw in his last summer in 1980. Once he found that bug again, he wrote, you know, an enormous amount of songs in a very brief period that would literally live on after him as they finished post-production on them. But I like to caution my students about going too far with studying their differences, because demographically, they're almost the same guy. You know, it's not like we're talking about somebody who was born in L.A. and somebody who was born in New York City or the Midwest or the South. These are guys from a very homogeneous working class culture. And it's important not to forget that. You know, they just happen to have, it's amazing that they found each other, firstly, and secondly, that they managed to wander into the orbit of people like Brian Epstein, and of course, I would argue even more importantly, George Martin.
Oh, excellent. Well, I definitely want to get to them too, because they played such an important role in there, and we're definitely going to come back to them in the later part of the show. And for those just joining us on The Mind's Eye, we're speaking with musicologist Ken Womack on the artistry of the Beatles. So, Ken, the Beatles, we know they continuously made astounding musical and lyrical leaps within that short period of output, and you can almost certainly draw lines to display the differences between some of the albums. So let's move forward. We're going to enter their Beatles stage, ones that both you and I seem to be the bigger fans of, and in my opinion, their songwriting was their most creative at this time. During this time, the Beatles worked together in the studio to create songs, arrangements, recordings. Was this more of a shared process during this time? And these are the albums that I'm talking about: Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the White Album, and Magical Mystery Tour. It seemed that they were letting Lennon and McCartney were letting go of some of that stranglehold.
They seem to be, you know, even when you listen to the commentary of somebody like George Martin, who can be very democratic in his commentary, they did seem to, even into 1968, see Harrison as a kind of junior partner in the band, you know. But they did start to let go a little bit as George would prove himself. He had a bit of a setback, as you probably know, with Sgt. Pepper when he tried to argue that only a Northern song should be his, you know, his track, and they were, you know, they actually rejected it. If you can imagine that, John and Paul rejecting another member of the band's song, but they certainly did. Part of what's so interesting about that period, and you can really see it developing in Rubber Soul and Revolver, if we could cast our glance backward for a moment, those are such key moments because they realize that they need to get off the road, that they must stop touring. First of all, it's killing them, and it's and literally begins to frighten them after the Beatles are, you know, bigger than Jesus Christ statement that Lennon makes that was republished in the United States. But they realized what the joy they were getting out of the studio and the new recordings that they were spending their time on. they needed to make space for that, and so first you have them giving up life on the road in the UK in the end of 1965, which they told in secret to Brian Epstein, and then of course in 1966 they quit the road in the United States, thereby effectively ending their touring years. By doing that, they open up this wide swath of time where they can spend nothing but pursue their art. And this was revolutionary at that time in the history of the business, because of course before that, you know, artists would struggle for time. This was the Beatles though, and they intuited what they wanted to do. They communicated this to EMI, and they had the run of the studio. Interestingly, we had a conference here at Penn State this year to celebrate the 50th anniversary, and we had one of the old studio hands, a fellow named Richard Langham, from that period, who worked at Abbey Road. And Richard was fantastic, and his memories were often very striking because they fell in contrast to what you might think about those heady days of making albums, such as the ones you just mentioned. Richard was talking about how nobody wanted to work with the Beatles. How if you saw the Beatles and they were in the studio, you immediately picked up a clipboard and looked like you were looking at it and walked past the door because you did not want them to call you in. Because you could get stuck there for 12 hours. You'd miss going home. Abbey Road Studios was very stingy about overtime and those sorts of things. They didn't pay their studio personnel that much, and people literally did not want to work with them because it was a very long and exacting process. But it was one that they all understood was more important, and they did this almost universally until the end. They recognized that it was more important than their egos, and so that's what makes that period so special. You know, the 100 takes or whatever it was that John Lennon would lament of "Obla Di Obla Da" during the White Album. He stuck it out because even though he may not have been fond of making the track, he knew it was more important than he was.
And it's such a testament to them. And in that time, if I was a producer, how could you not want to be on the Beatles album? Quite frankly, you're guaranteed one of the classic albums of all time, and you're saying no. I don't know, but I guess I can understand
it's
that.
It's stunning, really. I mean, but you have Jeff Emmerich asking to be taken out of their sessions in the mid-summer of 1968. You've got George Martin who goes on an extended holiday. And remember, for George Martin, the Beatles were his life's work. I think what ends up happening was something like that. And it's so rare in life, but I'm impressed when I read their story and I think about how they recognized this. They recognized that they were doing something really important, that not every band can walk in and show up with "I Just Seen a Face," "Yesterday," and "I'm Down," which I think were almost the same session. You know, that it's unusual to be able to come in and you've written "A Day in the Life" or "Strawberry Fields Forever," that these were magnificent compositions, and they were worthy of this kind of attention, that they had to get it right. Something special was happening. And, you know, that's really the definition of artistry, right?
Yeah.
That recognition that you're doing something that's going to be timeless, that's going to be a classic. And, you know, when something like that's on the line, first of all, it's an emotional burden because you're connected to it. And I think that's why people would drift in and out of their sessions. It's a lot to take. But then secondly, it forces you to have to keep rising above your own ego. One of my favorite moments in the Beatles story in this regard, I'm going to flash forward a little bit to the end, is when George Harrison quits the band, right, in January 1969. When he comes back, and he's back there in the studio with him, the one that he couldn't wait to get out of 10 days earlier, right? He pounds the chest on his heart, and he said, "Heart of hearts, this is where I should be." You know, and that emotional range of the importance of their art to me it still touches me. I still find it moving.
And it rings true to this day. And before you touched on George Martin, and let's talk about him for a little bit, because to me, he seemed like the fifth Beatle. That's how important he was in the production of their music. Do you think the Beatles would be the Beatles without George Martin?
No, I don't at all. I think that the great accidental story of their birth coalesces. You know, it's a happy accident that all of these wonderful things happen. But the fact that they wander into his studio and work for him and with him to capture their sound is a godsend. I love 60s music like I'm sure so many of your listeners. I love the Rolling Stones and early Pink Floyd and all of these bands. But listen to how they're recorded. They don't even sound, their recordings, as clean as the Beatles. George Martin worked like a dog on those recordings. When he realized late in 1962, early 1963, that this was something special, he treated those recordings with the utmost care. And so, consequently, when you hear them today, there's still a kind of freshness to the Beatles that other artists from that period don't have. So, on the one hand, you have that. On the other hand, he was a guy they looked up to. He thought he was as old as the hills. He was, 36 when they met him. You know, they thought he was, their grandfather. They respected him. He was an old Navy man. And they needed someone like that whom they could trust and believe in. And so when he would talk about chord changes or key changes or you name it, he was somebody who had stock. And, of course, they mistakenly also believed, and this is important, that George Martin was posh. He had that very mellifluous, upper crust London accent. They had no idea that he had a Cockney accent only a few years earlier that he had erased through elocution lessons. So he was really one of them, and unbeknownst to them, at least for a while, he understood them implicitly, and he was able to find a window into what they were doing. So it was an absolute marriage made in heaven. Martin was their secret weapon.
And it's amazing all the different factors that had to come together for them to become the Beatles and really the most influential band of all time. And we touched on it before. I think about how easily so many different events could have played out, and particularly even in the later part when they were ceding some power. And that's why I want to talk about George Harrison for a little bit, because when he starts to have a bit more direction, his songwriting starts to influence a group. I really think those last two albums are phenomenal, and particularly after Revolver. I think he's such an underrated member, and they knew he was a virtuoso, but even in the beginning they always kind of kept him at bay. And like we said, he wasn't a major contributor until Revolver, but he contributed significantly to several albums, and it's hard for me to get over how underrated George really was. And I know you're a huge fan of George Harrison, and especially when it comes to, I know you're truly fond of Here Comes the Sun and Something.
Oh, absolutely. And George is essential to their story. Sure, John and Paul had these big egos. We talked about 1964 and how they were nursed to have those egos, how they came about, how they were doing something that was amazing. But the Beatles were the sum of their parts. And when you have guys like that who want to come in and work on their song, sometimes for hours, right? You need a drummer like Ringo Starr who's not going to pipe up and try to fill up your song with fills, who's going to sit there and maybe go to August 1967 and spend 10 hours playing I'm the Walrus till you get it right? You need that guy. You need George Harrison, who's slightly younger, which was probably a bigger deal to them at the time. It certainly was a bigger deal to them at the time. You need a guy like that who's willing to sit there, take after take, try new things, sublimate their own ego. And George was magnificent at that. And of course, as you know from watching the Beatles anthology or Scorsese's great documentary about George, he was also very smart. And he, the idea, and you picked on this idea earlier, and I'm glad you did, of those sort of stereotypes about the Beatles. John's the blank one, Paul's the nice one, George is the quiet one. Well, as Cynthia Lennon used to say, he was anything but that. He was very talkative, very thoughtful, very incisive. He was recognizing the great things that they were doing, sometimes before they were. And he was an absolutely essential element in that band. You know, you can't imagine any of them really going on any further without each other, which is part of the magic of their story, right? The Beatles legend is made by the fact that they get out early. You know, they get out with Abbey Road, and they never really come back, despite the Threetles and, you know, the anthology series or what have you. They don't come back. There's a cachet to their story that I don't find necessarily in art or literature in any other place outside of them. It's really unique. But George was absolutely essential, and he developed as a songwriter. George Martin gives a lot of kudos to George through the period of the Beatles' span as a working unit. I think it's easy to argue that he has the most growth. You know, he comes from very rudimentary songwriting, and as you said a moment ago, he's ending up with Something, and Here Comes the Sun, or on the White Album, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, and you know, a great song from 1969 toward the end is Old Brown Shoe. That's a great imaginative tune that he comes up with. He drove them to be better, and by the end of their career, he was doing just that.
And no doubt about that. And I think one of the reasons that he had such a great solo career, I guess you could argue maybe it was really the best one creatively out of all of them, was the fact that he almost was kept at bay at times, and he was forced to find his own way in a sense, and to work with other musicians, and I think that helped him in his own solo career. Maybe at the time he wasn't looking at it that way, but looking back, I definitely think that played into why he was such a wonderful solo artist.
Well, there's certainly some truth to that. You know, George had a lot to prove, right? And clearly, as All Things Must Pass showed us and shows us now, he had a lot of material he was storing up, you know, that simply wasn't getting play in the band. And so, you know, it's fascinating to look back at his career. And I think I would agree with you. Creatively, he probably had the most linear solo career. You know, Paul and John have had their ups and downs. Ringo had a few moments, but a lot of false starts since the 1973 Ringo album. But George had a certain kind of creative flow to what he did. Of course, they were all outpaced by McCartney and what he achieved. For a while, of course, he was actually making more money as a solo artist. The 80s changed all of that, and I like to think of it as the rebranding or permanent rebranding of the Beatles. You know, they have a different cachet. Largely after Lennon's murder, you know, things changed pretty precipitously. But I would agree with that. I think George had a fascinating career, and of course we have these new Apple years recordings coming out. I'm very excited to get my hands on those so that we can get better versions of a lot of those Harrison albums.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well. And we haven't talked too much about Ringo, which probably is the case for most conversations about the Beatles, sadly. But you know, that really is a shame, because particularly in the early years, he was a really key contributor to their live performance energy, and we know he was never really a significant songwriter in the group. And John and Paul, they wrote their, I guess what they called them, Ringoisms into the songs. Do you think Ringo was kept in a box at all, or not? That he was who he was, and he almost was limited in a sense, or do you think he was kept in a box?
Well, I would no, I don't think he was at all, and I would make two observations. The first one is that he was, as I'm sure you know, when the Beatles came to America in 1964, in any survey, he was the most popular member of the band.
Right.
His lovability and his true affability really came through. He was very photogenic in the sense that those qualities that he had were able to be transmuted to the international world. I love looking back at the Maysles brothers. Remember the people who brought you Grey Gardens? They did a Beatles documentary that they did on February 7th through 9th, 1964, and on into Washington, D.C. when the Beatles first arrived. And their footage of Ringo is absolutely captivating. There's a moment when Ringo is walking around the interior of a railway car with the Beatles there and all of the reporters who, of course, came at them to destroy them as being this silly pop cultural phenomenon. This is serious news time, right? It's post-JFK assassination. And here they are, ready to destroy the Beatles. And Ringo is just sucking up to them. He has all their cameras wrapped around his neck. He's playing the clown, walking up and down this train car, and they're loving it. They are eating out of his hand. And he was essential to winning them a good press. And kids who are listening today, remember, you can never have too much of a good press. As the Beatles learned just 2 years later after John's remark about Jesus Christ, that could have been much worse, right?
Yeah.
People don't think about it that way. That whole controversy could have destroyed them. In some ways, it could end them. I mean, that's what companies fear, corporations fear, that kind of disaster. And yet they had a good press from those early years, and Ringo deserves a lot of that credit. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has that skill, you know. It's very unusual. Secondly, when I follow Ringo, and from those early years, and you're right, he had such a key moment in those live performances. But when you follow Ringo into the later years, he is just essential. To have a guy like that who will sit there while you work out the Abbey Road medley, or while you're working out, all of those complicated key signatures in a song like Good Morning, and not complain, he's worth his weight in gold. You know, it was, 700 hours they spent recording that. The toughest job in those recordings is being somebody like Ringo or George, who is called in at various non-specific moments to play on songs, while these other two and George Martin are working out, trying to record an album on 4-track. It's really remarkable.
Yeah, he really was essential to them, and almost everything has been said about the Beatles, but there's still a few lingering mysteries remain, and since I have the opportunity to speak with an authority such as yourself on the Beatles, it's hard to restrain myself, so indulge me for a little bit of time. And for me, there are
you got it.
Thank you, I appreciate that. There are two mysteries that I'd love for you to hopefully answer or kind of point me in the right direction. First, who was that cryptic voice behind those repeated words "number 9" in Lennon's Revolution 9? It haunts me to this day.
I absolutely don't know. When I was a kid, I think I was hopeful that it was George Martin. Because it has his kind of accent to it. When you get to know his voice, you realize it's not him. It was a test record that was sitting in the EMI library. They had an enormous raft of these records that they could use, and it was simply a test record that they played. Just like they had the sound effects record that produced the blackbird chirping for the song Blackbird, or the sound of the jet engines for back in the USSR. I believe it's from a test record. It's nothing, we don't know whose voice it necessarily is. And John and George, I believe, found it when they were working on the Revolution 9 track. But it is wonderful. And I have to tell you, not to scare future students off out there, but one of my favorite moments in my Beatles class is when I teach Revolution 9. It's really something to sit and listen to it in full. It does sound like terror, right? It sounds like apocalypse. It is a very dramatic and effective storyline in that way.
Yeah, it truly is haunting, and it's just hearing that over and over again. I can never get over it. I almost have to skip that song every time. It just, I don't know why, but it just freaks me out for some reason, and I have no good explanation for it, really, to tell you the truth. Is there something underlying there, maybe that they're trying to give me that feeling from creating that song? Well, what do you tell your students?
Well, I did an entire semester once that on the White Album, and only the White Album. It was a wonderful thing to be able to do that and have that kind of experience. And when you spend that kind of time on it, it's absolutely, it's really breathtaking to contemplate it, because as you know from studying the Beatles, you start off with the Esher tapes that they made back at George's home studio, and there's that post-India joy they have on those tracks. They're just fabulous. and then they go into the studio and they make this monumental thing, this White Album. And when you listen to the White Album as a song cycle, they really are moving toward apocalypse at the end of that album. And what I love about that moment, after you've heard those final words, what is it, hold that line, block that kick, or something like that, at the end of Revolution 9, then they give you that riddle. And to me, the riddle is the song Good Night. Is it a happy ending? Can you put a happy ending on Apocalypse? Or is it tongue-in-cheek? Is it an ironic, well, now that you've heard Apocalypse, good night? It's hard to say, but to me, it's just another piece of musical ambition. Can you believe that that's, 5 years since the release of I Want to Hold Your Hand in the UK, and you have that album? It's stunning. What other artistic enterprise goes at that speed?
It's astounding, those musical leaps that they made in such a short period, and that definitely is one of the reasons why I think they're so beloved by all, is that they always strive toward the highest professionalism and always making the best craft no matter what the cost is, and I think that bleeds through the music, and you have that energy every time you listen to it in a sense. And just to talk about that other mystery, I guess there's the holy grail of unreleased recordings. I think there's something called the Carnival of Light. It's the Beatles' infamous lost recording. Do you think that's ever going to come out, or we're never going to hear it?
Well, I undoubtedly do. I don't think there's any doubt about it. It's a commodity. EMI and the Beatles estate and the Beatles partnership, which of course has been reformed not too long after it was deformed. We'll see that as a commodity. It will certainly be available. I had a funny moment of that just a few weeks ago. The great and influential Beatles writer Mark Lewison was talking to me at Beatles Fest, and he saw my new Beatles encyclopedia. And I watched him flipping through it, and I was kind of curious, now where is Mark Lewison going to go, right? And he went right to Carnival of Light to see what I'd written about it. So I think everybody's fascinated by that track, and of course Mark's one of the few people who's actually heard it. I do believe we will hear it, and I think it will be. I think it'll be underwhelming. In a lot of ways. No, I do.
Well, at this point, it can't anything be but that, right? All the expectations are so high.
Remember, they've released most of, if not all of, what is really great about their achievement, and it obviously does not rival something like Sgt. Pepper, which they would complete in just a few months after making Carnival of Light. It probably would have seen the light of day, pun intended, if it really were worthy of it already. And I imagine that, and I don't believe I'll be wrong if I'm ever privileged to hear it, that it's the product of, those crazy psychedelic early moments in 1967 when brash experimentalism was the norm, and they were having fun with that for the Million Volt Light and Rave show, or whatever that thing was called that they did it for. I imagine we'll be underwhelmed, just like we'll probably be underwhelmed when we have the 27-minute version of Helter Skelter. One of the few times the Beatles were out of their mind on any kind of narcotics in the studio, and according to George Martin, they kind of produced something that would come out of that.
Yeah. When you spoke to Lewinson, did you grill him to at least tell you or sing you at least a sample since he did hear the song Carnival of Light? Because I would have put him under the light.
No, I didn't actually. I've read about it for years. What Harrison or Lennon says Barcelona several times. In a weird way, it sounds like a precursor to Revolution 9, but probably something not as textured and not as thought out. They just had to produce something for the rave, and they did. Today, of course, you'd have 100,000 people at the show recording it, and we would have it available to us, but of course that wasn't the case in January, February 1967. Everything I've read about it suggests that it will be fairly underwhelming. So much so that Paul was outvoted in around the time of the anthology in terms of even releasing it, which suggests something about it.
Yeah, they definitely wouldn't have released something, or they would have released it if it was up to the par of their standards, to say the least. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I want to make sure you have a few moments to do some personal plugs. But if you had to leave a lasting thought on the Beatles, in your opinion, how do you think they changed the world?
Well, I think that they elevated the idea of artistic ambition in really important ways. They really did. And you can see the seeds of that being sown in early 1965, mid-1965. You have Yesterday being released. Then you have Rubber Soul. And they do almost the unthinkable. They expanded a demographic that looked like it was only going to be teeny boppers, right? They took this demographic that was going to be very tightly coiled around teens and very young 20-somethings, and they exploded it all the way to the elderly. It's an amazing phenomenology. And then they made good on it, right? They kept coming back with these amazing chestnuts that everybody at some level could enjoy. And it's, to me, it's a stunning revelation, but that artistic ambition, they start that in earnest, certainly by Rubber Soul, and they ride that all the way to the last moments when they're working on, what is it, I Want You, She's So Heavy. That Wagnerian ending to the song, I think, was one of their last, if not the last, recording with all four of them in the studio, and it is just stunning to hear them coming through at those last moments and realize how much better they are than they were at the beginning. They are incredible guitarists. They're playing the piano with great fluency. Listen to those harmonies on Abbey Road, right? They are singing the hell out of that album with songs like Because and Sun King. The harmonies are just gorgeous. They really become virtuosos. They always were, but they bring it all to fruition. And then, of course, they do that magical thing. They have a song called The End, and they exit the stage.
When it goes into their legend, and their influence still reverberates today. And I know you have you do a ton of lectures on the Beatles, and I believe you have a handful of events coming up in the next month or so. Where can listeners catch your lectures on the Beatles and other subjects?
Well, let's see. I'll be at Texas State University in San Marcos, Texas, not far from Austin and San Antonio, in a month or so. I'm going to run out to New Orleans next year and do some Beatles talks there. I have iPod will travel. I'm proud to share the story wherever and whenever I can. I work a lot locally in Pennsylvania for Penn State. I give lectures around the region and in nearby states, and it's amazing the demographic of the people you see showing up. You've got, of course, those first-generation Beatles fans, the ones who came before, you and me, but then you also have their kids and their grandkids, and they're all there together, and they're all getting something out of that music. It's a joy. It's a responsibility, actually. I feel an obligation when I'm doing it to make sure I bring my all.
And we truly appreciate it. And before we say hello, goodbye, plug your other Beatles books and give out your social media sites for our listeners.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, you can see me at KennethWomack.com. All are welcome. I'm working on a brand new Beatles book that I'm very proud to do. I wasn't sure that I would do another one, to be frank with you. I felt, at a certain point you feel like you've said what you're going to say. But the book that we're missing right now is that biography of George Martin. And my next book will be, in fact, just that. It will be the biographical story of George Martin. And, of course, much of the weight of that story will be thrown at his work making those recordings with the Beatles and his signal and superlative role in bringing those great recordings to fruition. I'm going to make sure he gets full coverage for that part of the story. And I'm also, as you noted earlier, a novelist. I have 3 novels. And, in fact, I'm working on the screenplay these days. On the first one, it's being made into a feature film financing willing, and having a lot of fun with that. So
congratulations, and your hard work.
It's the writing life.
That's all we can do, but you're doing it pretty damn good, to say the least. And I can't wait for that next book to come out. And Ken Womack, fantastic job on Long and Winding Roads and talking about the night. I really think it is a must-own for any hardcore Beatles fans, and anyone who has read it, I doubt would disagree. And I really look forward to our next conversation, and hopefully we can talk about George Martin whenever that book comes out.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. It'd be my pleasure.
Excellent, Ken, and have a wonderful night, and we'll talk very shortly.
All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, Ken. Bye. All right, let's come together again next week at the same time. As always, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Eastern, we're diving into more pop culture and continue our celebration. In honor of the 20th anniversary of Quentin Tarantino's masterpiece, Pulp Fiction, The Mind's Eye will welcome guest Mark T. Conrad, professor of philosophy, who will reveal the film's metaphysical aspects explored in his article, Symbolism, Meaning, and Nihilism in Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction, from Philosophy Now. For more information on tonight's or next week's guest, pop over to the Mind's Eye website at www.themindseye.com. And don't forget, while you're there, to read my new blog entry, How Captain America, the Winter Soldier, Got History Right. Lessons on History and Patriotism. www.themindseye.com. And another one is in the books. And in the words of the Beatles, all things must pass. Today will become yesterday, and tomorrow never knows. But it has been a day in the life. From here on Long Island to all of the listeners across the universe, with words of love, I'm your host, Brian Turnov, for The Mind's Eye on Z Talk Radio.